African heads of state met in Ethiopia's capital Addis Ababa over the weekend for the 26th African Union Summit. The leaders focused on many of the major political, social and economic challenges now facing the continent. They discussed issues like efforts to restore stability in Burundi, economic development and the empowerment of African women. We begin with CCTV's Robert Nagila for more details on the large gathering in Addis Ababa. Robert?
The 26th African Union Heads of State Summit concluded on Sunday with Burundi and the International Criminal Court making the headlines. The theme for this year's summit was African human rights with a special focus on women. On Burundi, the Assembly rejected a proposal adopted in 2015 to send in peacekeepers to protect civilians and property. Instead, a delegation will be sent to Bujumbura to try and convince President Pierre Nkurunziza to allow in peacekeepers. On the ICC, a committee was mandated to come up with strategy, including the collective withdrawal of African states from the International Criminal Court. However, that remains an option for the moment. It's not as easy as it sounds. If that decision were to pass, the leaders still have to go back to their parliaments because those are the bodies that draft and ratify those types of decisions. On Somalia, the Assembly committed to strengthening the structures within AMISOM to make it more effective in fighting the Somali militant group Al-Shabaab. Now, all these decisions are meant to be implemented in the coming months. We will have more on that when the African Union meets in Kigali in June this year. Robert Nagila, CCTV, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
With us now from Johannesburg is William Gumede. He's an associate professor at the University of Witwatersrand. And from Nairobi, we are joined by Dr. Anita Kiamba. She is a lecturer at the University of Nairobi. And with me here in the studio is Ebrahim Rasool. He is a former South African ambassador to the United States, and he is a distinguished scholar in residence at Georgetown University. Welcome to all of you to the show. William, let me start with you. Broadly speaking, if we look at these issues that were discussed at the AU summit, we've got Burundi, where there have been protests against the president's attempt to secure a third term. There were the security concerns that are posed by groups like Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and of course there's the conflict still going on in South Sudan. And then there's a whole range of economic issues that the AU discussed. What kind of progress was made, do you think?
You know, I mean, the AU at the moment is being challenged. You know, in the past, you know, the AU made its contribution by, you know, bringing African countries together and helping, you know, to get some reasonable peace on the continent. But the continent right now is faced with a couple of challenges, and I think that the AU currently is really struggling dealing with these crises. For example, I mean, with Burundi really is, you know, there may be an absolute disaster coming there if the AU doesn't step in. And I'm afraid, you know, from where I'm sitting, it just seems to, you know, that the progress is just too slow in Burundi. And also, secondly, just in terms of, you know, the rise of fundamentalism across the continent, it just seems that the AU also has been rather slow in dealing with those issues. And of course, there's also the economic issues now. The economic issues across the continent, you know, many African countries are struggling because of the, you know, the oil price, the volatile oil price and so on, that the AU doesn't seem to, you know, to have played a key role there in trying, you know, to deal with the situation.
Dr. Kiamba, one of the other key themes at this AU conference was women's empowerment. Did we see any progress in that regard?
Thank you so much. I don't think we saw any progress whatsoever being made by those who attended the AU summit. I would expect that, for instance, they would have touched on quite a number of issues. For instance, the transition from the MDGs to SDGs, which more or less talks about the role of women in development. None of that was clearly highlighted, and therefore I'm quite pessimistic about the role of the AU and the members who are supposedly supposed to prop up the role of women in development, but it was clearly lacking. We saw quite a lot of other political issues being dealt with rather than women.
Well, one of the optimistic things about the African continent right now, Ambassador, is that 4 of the top 10 fastest growing economies in the world are on the African continent. That must augur well for organizations like the AU and for the continent itself.
And I think if you take a snapshot, that looks good. If you look at the video or the movie, when I arrived there as ambassador in the United States in 2010, we were boasting that 7 of the fastest growing economies were in Africa. We were boasting that Africa as a continent was the fastest growing region in the world after, say, China. And so, in a sense, I think that as a snapshot, it still augurs well. The problem is that we are going through an oil price depression. I think commodities are fairly depressed. I think that our #1 market, China, is facing some of its internal pressures and shedding a lot of its buying sprees that it used to do in Africa for commodities and so forth. And so the knock-on effect on Africa is very pronounced. I also think that when we were speaking about Africa, say 5 years ago, we were speaking about 60% of the arable land. We're now speaking about a drought that is gripping, and that aid, again, food aid to countries like Ethiopia are beginning to challenge even our assertion of the agricultural transition. The key question that I would hope that would have been discussed at the AU is, did we use the fat years to prepare for the lean years? Have we made enough progress on the transition from essentially a commodity-based economy to a far more manufacturing and knowledge-driven economy? And we may look back and say, maybe we have not done all of that. And then to boot, I think, as William was saying to us, we are now also beginning to see a backslide on the key achievements that made that economic prosperity possible. We are seeing a backslide in democracy, as you've discussed. In Burundi, we are seeing a return of conflicts from traditional sources like South Sudan, but also from new sources and virulent sources like extremism at the hands of Muslim fundamentalists in West Africa, North Africa, and East Africa. And so I think that what the AU needed to deal with, rather than simply a case by case, is to really take stock of whether we are on a downward spiral, and if so, how do we arrest it, and how do we at least do a holding operation to keep things even, and then to claw our way back up on the ascent that we were on before.
Well, William, the ambassador poses some key questions there. You know, how do you arrest this downward spiral that Africa seems to be experiencing right now? Also, you know, did Africa prepare sufficiently for the lean years after several years of, as the ambassador said, fat years?
No, our problem is that, you know, during the good years, you know, when we had the commodity booms, you know, we had this really, you know, high growth rates. In fact, the last decade, we've seen, you know, the longest growth spurts in Africa's post-independence history. Now, our problem has been, is that many African countries have not used, you know, the surpluses of the last decade and diversified their economies and, you know, creating new sectors, where it's manufacturing and so on. You know, that really is the fact, and it's a sad, you know, it's a sad story that we've ended up this way. But back, you know, just to the African Union, maybe, you know, I think the continent face again now a political and potentially an economic crisis. And what the AU should have done, you know, at his meeting now is to give us a direction. And I'm afraid to say, you know, we didn't get that sense of, you know, a new direction because, you know, the world right now also, you know, is in crisis. I mean, we have seen, you know, the US, for example, is busy putting together a big Pacific trade deal, you know, between it and countries in the Pacific. Now, where does it leave African countries unless African countries actually get their own trade union together as quickly as possible? We are going to be bypassed by all of this development that's going on around the world. And I'm afraid to say, you know, the AU doesn't seem to have actually given us a lead here.
Dr. Kiamba, what's your sense of whether the summit recognized these problems that William has been talking about, that the ambassador has been talking about, that beset Africa right now, and whether there was the will among leaders at this meeting to tackle those problems?
Well, I think a lot has been said about maybe economic development in Africa so far since I think the early last decade. Africa usually has the African Economic Outlook. And every single year from October to the next October, we usually outline what needs to be done. And in this way, I think Africa has already made strides in trying to understand what we need to do in order to have ourselves up when it comes to economic development. But on the other hand, when it comes to economic integration, we have seen slow progress made by governments in that direction. Indeed, I think the last agreement between African nations and between the regional organizations was to come together in agreements. For instance, we had a tripartite agreement between the East African Community, between SADC or the South African Development Corporation, and the Common Market for South Africa, Eastern South Africa. And even with that in place, we have seen still little strides made towards economic development. So one would say that, for instance, the AU hasn't been too serious in that direction. And we need, ultimately, at the end of the day, not to make it one, or not to make the integration one in which we are relying too much on political goodwill, but rather to rely on other triggers, on other indicators that are able to lead us towards economic development.
Ambassador, to be fair, some of the problems that Africa faces are none of its own making. I mean, you mentioned the falling oil price. That cannot be placed at the door of Africa, although it should benefit some African countries, shouldn't it? And the fact that commodity prices are dropping, I mean, that's a worldwide trend.
Look, I think that we can make a case for every crisis that Africa is having as a knock-on from other regions. I think that now that there's talk of the United States thinking of boots on the ground in Libya, it reminds us who precipitated so much of the instability in the Maghreb, so much of the instability in the Sahel that has now spilled over onto West Africa and kept the fires burning in East Africa. And it comes from Resolution 1973. Where NATO unilaterally provided the rebels with an air force and deposed and collapsed an infrastructure and didn't worry about the arms. So we can argue that. I think secondly, we can also argue that the outcome of the US-Africa Leaders Summit, that where amongst others, Africa demanded baseload energy provision and the US came with boutique renewable energy solutions that didn't even begin to address the energy deficit in Africa that could have given rise to its industrial revolution. I think we can look at that as a lost moment. I think we can also look, for example, at the way in which, when we don't hold the line on a coup in Egypt, we will invite coups in other places, and people think it's fair game. And so the point that I'm making is that every one of these, but the African Union has been established with a vision that we are the masters of our own destiny, that we are not victims on the world stage, that we are going to be agents of our own transformation, liberation, and prosperity. And that, I think, is where we need stronger hands. So it's good to see that former President Kikwete going to do an intervention in Libya. I think the way in which our détente in Burundi is going to work out will show whether Burundi respects the language of dialogue or whether they would have respected the 5,000 troops that would have come in. Those are terrible choices to be making. And so, and it will also ask enormous questions, such as what William has already begun to ask. Did the money that we made during the fat years circulate amongst elites, or did we invest in infrastructure? Did we invest in education? Did we invest in our 2063 vision? That ultimately is the test that must be passed.
Well, I want to get to those questions that you pose, unemployment, education, things like that. But